All right, if everyone just wants to sort of settle into their spots for the next 75 minutes, it's my great pleasure to introduce two Google speakers tonight who are giving completely distinct talks. Brian Fitzpatrick is in the front row, and he'll be talking about how to help your open source project survive poisonous people. And Dan Peterson, who's a UIUC alumni and extremely familiar with the entire process of conference, will be starting our talk off with extending the open web. Thanks.
Is the mic on? There we go. So today, right, today I'm going to talk about what it means to be part of the open web. I'll define some principles about what it means to be part of the open web and share some examples from my own experiences with the open web. I'm a product manager at Google, been working on developer technologies for a bunch of years now. And along the way of sharing these examples, I'll throw out some best practices around sort of if you're building open web technology as well. So let's start at the very beginning. So way back in the late 60s, ARPANET. This you might consider the big bang of the internet. Vince Cerf and a bunch of grad students at UCLA put together this initial prototype. And since ARPANET, things have become just a bit more complicated. So that's 3 decades later, a snapshot of major ISP networks put together by Lucent. But that was in '99, so imagine how things probably look today, a decade later. More nations getting online, more phones, and just generally more people on the internet. To consider some numbers that sort of go along with this crazy chart here, in 1998, sorry. So for some numbers that sort of parallel this chart, in '98, Google's search index was aware of 26 million web pages. But in 2008, we knew about more than 1 trillion URLs. So significantly many more zeros in just one more zero, right? We can also look at XKCD. So in 2007, this is what Randall put together as what the map of online communities look like. So each of these countries represents the size of a given site on the web. And whether it's MySpace or Orchid or Facebook, it's just sort of showing them along with some colorful commentary on top about who's doing well and who's kind of crazy and that kind of stuff. And actually just last week, Randall was kind enough to put out this new comic. And one really interesting fact about this is that the metric changed. So the slide from the comic from just a couple years ago was about user size, right? The size of a given site based on the number of people who are on it. But this is actually a whole different metric. It's a metric around, activity or user engagement on a given site to the best that Randall was able to figure it out, either by getting sysadmins drunk or just reading online marketing pages. It's not always the easiest information to come about because sites get rather sensitive about it. So the bottom line here is that the web is constantly growing and constantly changing. And along with this changes, there's a lot of new technologies that come about. So these are just a few examples of some of the sort of open web technologies that have been developing over the years. So whether it's OAuth for managing authentication, or things like PubSub, Hubbub, or Salmon for managing data syndication across various sites, there are a lot of grassroots communities springing up to help solve problems to bring new functionality to the web. But what does it mean to be part of the open web? So when I've been thinking about this, there's really two sort of principles that go along with being part of the open web. Number one is distributed control. And number two, it needs to have a liberal IP license. So distributed control. The concept of a benevolent dictator doesn't really fly in the very purest sense of that word. The situation here is that you need to really listen to the entire community. I'm not going so far as to say that every voice is binding in terms of a binding vote, because that also has its own complications. but you do need to sort of let everybody voice their own opinion. And every community will come up with their own mechanism for managing this. But one best practice is you want to avoid pay-to-play. So by pay-to-play, I mean the concept of you have to put up dollars to be able to have a binding vote. That really imbalances the whole situation. It means that the little guys are less likely to be able to get involved with this particular web technology. And that's a problem, because they have unique perspectives on the whole thing. In the IP arena of the game, I've learned entirely too much about intellectual property law over the years. I hope you don't have to relearn that. So it's important, though, because you need to have the IP be clean enough such that organizations are willing to use the technology. Who cares if you have the best toaster if nobody's going to use your toaster? The deal there is that if you don't have a clean IP license, then people are worried about a random patent troll coming along and saying, I have a patent on that, you can't use it, and that at least slows down the adoption of the technology, if not kills it altogether. And then the flip side of it is that people who are contributing to this technology need to agree to the IP policy so that it all hangs together, basically. And it even goes so far as some communities won't even look at patches from new contributors until they've checked the little box that says, yes, I agree to your IP license. So one best practice that fell out of all of this is use known good IP policies. So basically, if there are a common set of policies that already exist, you can sort of borrow from another community, and that way people don't have to, if people have already accepted that license for project A, they can accept it for project B as well. So let's look at how these open web communities compare to more formal standards bodies. So things like Salmon or PubSub, Hubbub aren't actually standards in the very formal sense of the word. There are many organizations that operate differently than these open web communities. That said, things like many of these open web technologies mature and end up becoming a piece of the standards organization. So OAuth actually now has an IETF working group associated with it. So it's sort of as they mature thing, they end up heading towards standards bodies. But it's important that you don't get there too quickly, because then it slows you down. You're not going to make enough technical progress before you get into the standards body, because in some cases these standards bodies move at a slightly different pace, shall we say, than the open web communities. So one best practice there is add process only when you really need to. So if you're 5 guys sitting in a room working on some new technology, you probably have very little process. You just write it down. You're done. But when you have a much more larger set of people involved with the technology, you need to build new processes. So really it's just sort of do it when things are broken. Don't do it too soon. So to look at how there's the open web versus open source, they're actually very complementary to each other. But the main deliverable behind open web is a protocol. And that protocol really means diverse implementations, whether it's an implementation in a wide set of products or a wide set of open source tools. Either way works. But open source is all about the code, whereas open web is all about the protocol or the evolving standard or emerging standard. So the Apache Software Foundation is an organization that is very well respected for producing high quality communities that just happen to build good software. The main focus is on building a very strong community that then attracts people who are building good software, because it's a meritocracy where people are evaluated based on what they actually deliver to the community, as opposed to, again, like things like pay-to-play. So best practice, learn from Apache. There's a lot of documentation out there, and they do a good job of teaching people the quote-unquote the Apache way. So let's look at what's been happening in the social web just to get a bit more concrete with some of these principles and best practices. The social web is one of the hotter areas these days, and a lot of technologies are evolving from the bottom up. So Joseph Smar, one of my colleagues, put together this sort of the new open stack around things like discoverability of information and contact schemas and authentication and and identity on the web. But there's more, right? Like the playground is getting kind of busy lately. And what I'd like to do now is actually talk through, in specific, OpenSocial, which is one of the areas I was working on previously. So for those who aren't familiar, OpenSocial itself is a common API, lets you build applications or leverage data across a wide variety of sites. And you've probably heard Java's write once, run anywhere ambition. And you know what we were doing with OpenSocial is more about learn once, write anywhere. So we recognize that there's going to be lots of different implementations for policy reasons, and so you can learn the feel of the API and then apply that to wherever it's implemented, like on these sites. So at the same time, when you have this many people involved with a common standard, you're going to need some way to manage that concept of distributed control. And so what we did there is we actually put together a nonprofit organization to manage this whole thing. So the OpenSocial Foundation itself had two goals. One was to manage the intellectual property so that all those companies are comfortable using this technology and able to contribute to it and things like that, and sort of market and advocate the technology. But secondarily, this nonprofit of people who are interested in the technology was designed to get out of the way of the developers. You just want to let the engineers focus on making the best technical decisions, so that way it results in the best API and developers are happiest using it on the flip side. This is the spec process that emerged from that. The tenets here are actually fairly similar to some of the concepts in the Apache Software Foundation, where participation is open to anyone and the decisions are made on a public list, not in backroom meetings. All proceedings being captured, that kind of thing. Individuals representing themselves, not their company affiliation, is another important one. It gives them that perspective and that ability to say, here's the technical decision, here's why we're making this decision. And it does mean that it puts the burden on the people who are contributing to make it clear when they're representing their company or representing themselves. It can be challenging, but it's a common thing when you're working in the open web to wear many hats. And one of the best practices that came out of this is we were actually treating the specification for OpenSocial like an open source project where the spec was basically the code. So that means people could see transparently how it evolved over time with the version control system and things like that. Double slide. So the social web is continuing to evolve. There's always been this concept of getting to the federated social network and seeing how we can basically let people interact no matter what social product they're on. It's still very much a work in progress. There are efforts like Diaspora you may have heard about, which had a pretty good Kickstarter campaign. And Diaspora is looking at doing sort of attacking the whole problem and letting people run their own slice of a distributed network of a social network. And there's another approach that's sort of coming around, which is sort of using some of these open web technologies as building blocks to build, eventually, hopefully, the federated social network. And we can look at SWOT 0, which is the social web acid test. So I don't know who all knows about acid testing. I mean, it began with recognizing gold among bits of metal, but became a little bit more in our sphere with browsers and the acid tests around CSS 1.0 back in the late 90s. But the social web acid test was put together by some folks just before OSCON back in July, so this is pretty fresh. And the idea here is this serves as a baseline for getting towards that federated social network. The idea is that, so this is 3 different sites. There's status.net, buzz.google.com, and ClickSet, 3 sites that are involved with letting people post their thoughts, like sort of a stream concept, and then comment on it. But SWOT 0 means that you can post from one spot and comment from another spot, and it all just works. And so that's what people, this is sort of the baseline, what people are working towards right now, including Google Buzz and ClickSet. It would be nice to be able to support this. But nobody's got so far as to figuring out what SWOT 1 is. So I think there's an opportunity there to figure out where people go. Yeah, please. A salmon slap, yes. So salmon is the protocol for swimming back upstream from where you got the original data. So you're basically saying, hey, I got this, so let's send it back so that the person who sent me that data knows that I got it. So that's what I was going to say about the social web. Google Wave was my most recent project at Google, and I've been particularly involved with the APIs, the open source angle, and the federation protocol. And you probably heard about Google Wave and understand that we were working on introducing a new style of communication and collaboration. The idea being just to improve efficiency, and it evolved around hosted conversations. And it was hosted conversations, and it also had a powerful API where people were able to build automated participants to this wave and gadgets to sort of extend the UI. Many people look at the platform as being one of the more compelling pieces, which also includes this concept of the protocol, where the protocol was working towards having many wave providers so that you could have lots of collaboration systems working together. In August, Google announced a strategy shift where we're no longer developing Wave as a standalone product. So you're probably wondering what's happening next with Wave. So just from a functional perspective, and then I'll jump back to the open web angle of Wave. But from a functional perspective, there's more open source code. So we're working towards Wave in a box. So initially, when we were open sourcing Wave as we were building out Google Wave, the product, we'd gotten to a point where we'd open sourced nearly a dozen different components of the system, but they were in component form. So there was no actual application you could grab and start running on your own. And we got something like 250,000 lines of code out there, Apache 2 licensed Java for those who are interested. But the idea is, with Wave in a box, you'll be able to just grab this binary and bring it up on your own system. And that's powerful both for users who are using Wave for their workflows or for their meeting notes or for whatever it might be, but also for developers who want to take it further and extend the technology by making it scale better or adding feature X or feature Y. And it will be interesting to see where things go with it. The second piece in terms of what's next for Wave, I don't have anything in particular to announce around a Google product integration or anything like that, but Google is looking more and more at the technology, like in terms of how to integrate it with other Google products. I can cite a few examples of influences we've had on other Google products at this stage. If you look at being able to drag and drop attachments into Gmail, that was a pretty useful feature that got added effectively as a result from being able to drag and drop into a Wave. There's also the photo viewer in Google Buzz. They look rather similar. They weren't so much shared code. Sharing code is actually a lot harder than sharing ideas, unfortunately. And then there's another one that I can point to. You may have seen the character-by-character updates that Google Docs recently implemented with their new editor system. That's another influence of Google Wave. So it's cool to see those influences out there. So back on the open web side of things. So in terms of the two principles, distributed control and clean IP licensing, Wave itself has always satisfied principle number 2 in terms of a clean IP license. We were liberally licensed from day one, and people were able to get involved and run with it and contribute and not fear retribution of a patent lawsuit later, basically. In terms of distributed control, it was a benevolent dictatorship, because that's what was appropriate at the time. There was a lot of learning from 2 years of incubation inside Google that we were working on sharing with the rest of the world. And we were working towards figuring out how to move it into something like an IETF working group or something of that nature, but we were sort of just still developing it in the open. So this goes back to the don't add too much process too soon. But benevolent dictatorship is a valid process. So that's where we were sort of at the very beginning. And so right now, the Wave open source community is evolving from that to figuring out what the new process should be. And we're still working on that with everybody else who's still involved with it. The point there being that Novell, who was building Novell Pulse with the Wave Federation protocol, and SAP building SAP Streamwork with the Wave Federation protocol. We need to figure out how to manage the disparate opinions among the various people involved without using pay-to-play. So this was the initial diagram around having many different wave providers involved out on the web. I think it's still a really good idea, and I think it's still a big opportunity. It's possible that things were just too early with Google Wave, the product. Too many things were changed. And it'll be really interesting to see where things go as the technology sort of incubates in the open. So just to sort of circle back to some of the best practices I mentioned earlier, I won't run through them one more time, but I just sort of summarized there at the end. One particularly important one around using known good IP policies. So there's the Open Web Foundation, which is a fairly recent effort among a bunch of sort of open web geeks, you might say. And they are putting together sort of an Apache for protocols. The idea is they're putting together an IP license that can be applied to many different open web technologies so that people don't have to be lawyers to get involved with these technologies. So if you're looking to start up your own open web technology because you have some idea of something you want to fix on the web, you can probably borrow a lot from what they're doing and hopefully just use their IP policy. So that is really the bottom line. If you want to get involved with the open web, just take a stab at it, either by jumping into a mailing list for one of the existing projects or talk amongst yourselves and figure out what you might want to build and take a shot at it. I can take a couple questions if people have it, and otherwise I will hand off to Fitz for his talk.
It seems like in social media there's a lot of land grabbing going on. They want to be the first in this area, they want to do whatever, so there's a lot of fragmentation that do kind of the same thing, but in their own space. Is that because the technologies, the protocols weren't around so they could collaborate and share and expand what they needed to do, or is that still this my idea, my community, my environment, and they don't want to necessarily play in the protocol area?
So I think that from the land grab perspective, users are still, having a lot of users is still valuable. It attracts developers to build with your protocols. And I think that's one of the reasons that people don't always go down the path of standardization first. It kind of goes back to adding process too early. If you are going to do open web stuff, it means that you're not the only person involved, and so you have to listen to more people and build out. You can build feature X and then go the protocol route later, and lots of things do that. But it takes more effort to add the protocol piece.
Then building an identical mirror of something and then having to do all the other ramp up and things that involve.
Yeah.
How does standard setting work in an open manner? It's not like an open source project where I say, okay, I'm going to grab and fix this code and I'm going to do it on my own and then upload it and you can check it. And there has to be more consensus built in.
Yeah. So in the case of OpenSocial, what we did was we had basically a time window, and we set up a process, a timeline, and if you wanted to propose a new idea for this version of the spec, do it by day X, then vote on all the open issues. And people who could vote was actually anybody. So we went so far as to say that every vote was binding. At some point that would no longer scale, and we can change that, but we've been able to avoid having to change that for now. And after that, we basically would cull and say, how many of these can we pull off? Propose that as, here's the scope for version 0.9 or 1.3 or whatever the version number is. And from there, we actually then borrowed from IETF around rough consensus and running code and said that if you're actually going to end up becoming part of the official version, you have to build the prototype. And it has to actually work before you can become part of the actual thing. So that was sort of the next phase of prototyping. And then at the end of having all the prototyping, we put together the resultant spec and said, these things were the things we wanted to do, here's the things we actually built, and then here's the spec. And in the case of OpenSocial, we actually had a corollary Apache incubator project where a lot of the prototypes were happening, but not all of them. So I sort of set up how some of these open web communities come together, and Fitz is going to talk us through poisonous people.
Thanks, Dan. All right, let's get this slide thing transition here. Okay, thank you. So it's really great to be back here. Despite the fact that this says open source project, this isn't just about open source projects. This isn't just about open source. It isn't just about projects, but it is a lot about dealing with poisonous people. Our initial title for this had a lot more to do with the orifice out of which your body expels waste. However, that did not go over so well. It didn't have the same ring to it as poisonous people did. Before I get started, I would like to point out, this is my third time here at Reflections Projections. I'm really glad to be back. It's my second time speaking here. I come here all the way down the interstate from Chicago, where I started Google's engineering office 5 years ago. This is our unofficial official doodle based on a Frank Lloyd Wright window. Since most people would assume that everything Google has to do with Mountain View, I would like to make sure you understand that I had nothing to do with Mountain View as far as where I work. So that said, before I go on to tell you about open source, I will tell you that you should steal this book. Now, that's actually not true because it's free, so there's no real joy in stealing this book. But these are my opinions, and there's a lot of different ways to run a community. And if you completely disagree with me on this, I invite you to get your own talk next year and say that everything I told you was wrong. But this is based on my experience in writing software over the past 10, 12, 13, 14 years. And a lot of it's based on this book. And both of these are based on experiences with Subversion and the Apache Software Foundation. Yes, I was one of the authors of Subversion. How many people here use Subversion? Anyone? I'm really, really sorry. No, I'm just kidding. I actually do use Mercurial now, but don't tell anybody that. So before I start yapping on, I have a question for all of you, most of whom I hope are studying something related to computer science. Otherwise, you're probably in the wrong place. What is the hardest problem facing us today in software engineering when it comes to writing new software? Anybody want to take a stab at that? In the back, you all the way back there. Motivating yourself to write it. Okay. Over here, I saw a hand. Okay, right there. Collaborating with other people. Give that man a cigar. Anyone else? Yes. Understanding what the real requirements are. And I'll take one last person. Yes. Figuring out if it's already been written. That's a really great point. There are two things. I would say number 2 and number 3 are deciding what the problem is and how the heck you're going to solve it. Okay? Those are the second and third biggest problems. The first biggest problem is the guy sitting next to you, writing code on your team. So everybody look next to you. They're your problem. Okay? Now, how many folks in the room have taken class on compilers? How about languages? Anyone taking a class on a language? Java, C++, Haskell, anything like that? The Haskell guys can never get their hand up all the way. They're like, maybe. I'm sure all of you have taken these classes, but I bet you none of you have taken a class on how to actually write software with a team of people. Okay? There are no classes out there. There are no books about this. There is no lesson on how to deal with other people, especially when those other people are socially dysfunctional, maladjusted individuals. Not that there's any of them out there, or that I've worked with any of them. So, what I want to talk to you about 4 important things when it comes to dealing with people who are, let's say, less than great people to work with. You have to understand what your problem is. You have to fortify against the problem. You have to identify the people and the attributes that are causing the trouble. And lastly, you've got to disinfect these things. Okay? So, we'll start off the beginning with understanding what the threat is. Okay? What is the threat? What is the problem with poisonous people? Why is it so bad to have people who are trying to distract and keep you from making progress, writing software, or getting your work done? The fact of the matter is that attention and focus are finite sources. Okay? There's no project anywhere, open source or otherwise, has an unlimited amount of attention and focus. There are a lot of companies that think they have unlimited amount of financial reserves, but when you're working on the software, the time that you're putting into that software is really important, and some people tend to try and distract you from that. Poisonous people not only distract you, but they emotionally drain your project and your community, and they tend to cause needless infighting. And I say needless because usually it's not infighting that's helping the project move along. It tends to be infighting that is pointless. It tends to be discussions that have happened before, and it tends to be completely avoidable. Sometimes it's not always bad people or evil people who can derail your project or cause trouble for you. Obsessive-compulsive people can derail forward progress. They might be perfectionists. Dan talked a bit about process. They might be people who are obsessed with process and want you to focus on the way that you're going to get things done, not so much getting things done. And nice guys can do this completely unintentionally. Okay, these can be people who really want your project to succeed. And the famous quote here is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. There was a guy we worked with in Subversion, really brilliant guy, who was just obsessed with perfecting something. And we went back and forth with him and back and forth with him when we were trying to design something over and over and over again. He was never happy with it. We did improve it a great deal, but after a point we realized that he would keep discussing this until the end of time if we let him. So finally we said, okay, we've gone through this enough. We're going to cut bait and we're going to go ahead and implement this. And he was a little annoyed, but he was okay. He turned out to be okay with it in the end. But we just sort of had to realize that we don't want to get rid of this guy. We want to hear what he has to say. He's got valuable stuff to contribute. But in the end, you just have to realize, okay, we're going to stop at this point, and we could discuss more about it maybe some other lifetime. So that's the basic comprehension. Remember, poisonous people aren't always the bad guys. Okay. So how do you fortify against poisonous people? Okay. The basic thing you do here is you need to build a strong community, okay? And there's 4 things that you build a strong community on. And this has to do with any team or community that you work on. These 4 things. There are communities out there that are not built on these 4 things, and I won't mention any names like the Linux developer community. But there are communities out there who are built on people, posing and growling at each other and like making, big like sort of aggressive moves at each other. And swearing at each other and insulting each other. That's great. I don't want to have any part of those communities. Not just because I don't think they're a lot of fun to be in, but I think they're massively inefficient. They spend a lot of effort on things that don't contribute to writing software and shipping software. Okay? So I'll talk quickly about some best practices on these things. Now, some of these might seem a little bit obvious. Some of them might seem a little bit hokey or corny. They're a little bit based on process. But more than anything, they're incredibly effective at doing this. The first one is one of those things. Anyone ever hear someone say, you need to come up with a mission statement? And you're like, nothing more boring than hearing someone talk about mission statements. Because what is a mission statement? It's some corporate gobbledygook, doublespeak crap that just tells you need to write up a whole bunch of things about what your mission are, and then you ignore them. Well, that's definitely not the case on the ignore part. And if it's a bunch of gobbledygook, you're doing it wrong. Just because a lot of people out there do this really poorly doesn't mean that you shouldn't do this, okay? So to talk about what a mission should be, there are 2 things you need to do in a mission. One is you define a direction, and then the second thing you do is you limit your scope in that direction, okay? If you don't limit your scope, you could go anywhere. Now, the interesting thing about coming up with a mission statement is this is the point at which you find out how much your team has no idea what everyone else is doing. Okay, we talked at the very beginning, someone pointed out that defining what your problem is and how you're going to solve it. When you sit down and you attempt to condense into a sentence or 2 what you're about and what you're not about, and really, really fight to condense that down, that's when you find out how much this guy thought we're going to go over to the left, someone thought we're going to go to the right. When different people in your team are going in different directions, you don't go in any direction. You wind up sitting in the same place, just sort of getting pulled in a million directions. Very frustrating. No one typically wants to do that. The Subversion mission statement was a compelling replacement for CVS. I would argue that that was very successful. It had a direction. We're going to replace CVS, so we're going to write a version control system. It had a limitation, which is we're not going to include a whole bunch of other crazy crap in it, like a social network, build tools, compilers, et cetera, et cetera. I can't stress enough how important it is to come up with this. The Google Web Toolkit, Dan and I, first thing we worked together on, we came up with a mission statement for that team. And the director of Google Web Toolkit, I talked to him, this was like 5 years ago. I talked to him a couple months ago, and I said, I really appreciate how supportive you were of me when I said that how important it was to do this, because I was advising them on open sourcing. And he said, well, I really didn't actually think you knew what the hell you were doing. He's like, but I wanted to give it a shot. He said, and in hindsight, it was one of the most important things we did, he said, because he realized that two of his tech leads both thought we were doing different things. And it was sort of a moment for them to sort of gel on what they were doing. But again, another thing that's kind of tricky. This is pretty simple and obvious, mailing list etiquette. A lot of people will join your project and suddenly want to rehash old discussions. Okay? Send them to the archives. Give them a link and point them to an archive that's available on your internet, on your intranet, whatever. You don't want to start having the discussion again because you've already had it, you've already closed it. Let them see what's already been said about this. Another thing is, and I'm sure everyone's seen this, is someone replying to every message on a thread. Okay? You have 100 people on a mailing list, someone replies to something, 10 of the people reply, and then the next person comes in and they individually reply to every single message. That is incredibly distracting, and it's a good idea to call that out when you see someone doing that. Say, look, summarize, make one reply. The next thing is email filibustering. Okay, I've seen dozens and dozens of times where there will be, actually, if you look carefully, there's consensus. 99% of the people agree on what you're doing, but there's one person who doesn't agree, and they really, really don't agree what's going on. And so what they're going to do is they're going to reply to everyone's email. And they're going to keep replying, and they're going to keep replying. And you look at this, and you're like, oh, wow, you know, there's a lot of discord here. There's a lot of disagreement about what we're going to do. And if you look carefully, you see it's one person, maybe two, who are just going to keep making noise to sort of distract you from that. So we call that a noisy minority. Next one is documenting things. You should document design decisions. You should have design docs. You should document your bug fixes in a bug tracker. Code changes in a change log. That seems pretty obvious, okay? Another thing that I always encourage people to document is document your mistakes. Document things that you've done or things that you've attempted that didn't work out. Things that were, you know, we went down this path, we figured out it wasn't proper for us, this is why. You document that. And it's really important because if you don't document this stuff, you're going to wind up having these discussions again and again and again and again. And there's really no fun with that. And I'll point out a very interesting social issue with web pages. If someone shows up with a mailing list and asks a question and someone pipes up and says, yes, I will answer your question. We decided that we wanted to go this way because of X, Y, and Z. The person will come back and say, well, I think you should go that way because of A, B, and C. And they will, well, no, we decided this. And they will go back, and they will go forth, and they'll go back and forth and back and forth. If, however, you say, you know, we decided not to do that, and here's a web page that says what we do and what we don't do. People are like, oh, a web page. Clearly, somebody thought about this. You know, even if it's a wiki, even if you put it together 10 minutes before you responded to it, you point to a web page, and suddenly they're like, wow. You know, some serious thoughts going into this. Code collaboration. There's some real basic things around code. Most people love to write code. Most people don't like to be criticized. When people start working in the open source world, they'll often ask me, so what should I do? How should I go about, you know, what are some good tips in working in open source? I say, go to your local taxidermy and buy an elephant skin and wear it with you when you're typing on your keyboard. Because people in the open source world tend to be really direct, really straightforward, and they tend to be very critical of what you're doing. I didn't study computer science in college. Big surprise there. I studied Latin and Greek, but I got a minor in ceramics in case all that didn't work out. And so here I am today talking to you. Least qualified person in the room, probably. I did all my learning through working 80, 90-hour weeks at a job and writing open source in my spare time because I was obsessed with it. I had all these open source people who were incredibly critical, but it was like having one-on-one time with some of the best teachers you've ever dealt with or the best person you've ever worked with. And it taught me a lot. And code reviews were the most valuable thing, not only for me to learn, but for the quality of the software that we were all writing. So I highly recommend that everyone work in a place to use code reviews. If you go to a job and you're going to work somewhere that doesn't review their code, I would personally be really nervous about it because that typically means that they don't value high-quality code. And certainly, again, I'm biased. These are my opinions. Feel free to disagree with me. When it comes to working with version control, if you're going to do bigger changes, do them on a branch or do them in your local copy, but make sure that you get them reviewed by people. One of the reasons that I tend to be I love the distributed version control. I love the fact that I could do all these things like local branches, local commits, etc. The thing that worries me about that is completely a social issue. If someone sits at home and writes 10,000 lines of code and comes out and says, hey, I want you to review my 10,000 lines of code, nobody's going to review 10,000 lines of code. You can't. You can look at it for style as far as, like, did they indent properly? Did they use the proper naming conventions for their variables? Did they not do something really stupid with C++, which is really easy, as we know? But you can't actually review for the code. That's where you need typically 500 lines or 1,000 lines max for a review point. But anything that big should have a design doc and be done in a separate part of the repository. Increase your project bus factor for code collaboration. Who knows what the bus factor is? No one. Somebody. All right, the bus factor is the number of people who have to leave your project for you to be left in a world of crap. Okay? So when I say leave, I mean obviously hit by a bus. Okay? And people get hit by a bus all the time, not just by an actual city bus or a mega bus. People get hit by a bus by having kids, or changing jobs, or graduating, or any one of a million different things. If you have just one person knows part of your code, you're in deep trouble, and you should work to make sure that doesn't last very long. One other point I want to talk about healthy code collaboration is something that people don't often think about, because people like to get credit. I like to get credit. My name's on my slide deck. I want you to know that I'm here talking about this. But I don't believe in names in code. Typically, you open up a file at the top, it says author, Brian Fitzpatrick, fitz@google.com. And that might be one way of doing things at companies, but when you put your name in the top of a file, it's sort of like saying, I own this part, I wrote this part. The question is, at what point does someone else put their name? Do they have to write maybe 50% more code, 100% more code, 2 lines, a function, a class? What if they delete some of your code? What if somebody else fixes a bug? Does their name go there? You get into this whole, wasting all this time thinking about whose name goes where, okay? If you want credit, it's going to be in the version control system. If you want credit on the project, it's going to be on the project's page. Starting to put names in code is not the place to sort of start staking out territory. Back to processes again. That's a big sort of theme you're hearing tonight. There's some very basic processes. And again, all these tie in that poisonous people, because these are the kind of things that most people are trying to derail you. Poisonous people being defined as people who are going to derail you from shipping code. They tend to not like these sorts of things. So releasing software, backport your bug fixes, accept and review patches from people. Okay, if you want more people to join your project or come along and help you, that's a good way of doing it, especially in the open source world. But the thing to remember is that the founders of the community establish the culture around your project or your team or whatever you do. The people who founded Reflections Projections have had a profound influence up to this day on the culture around running this conference, whether they realize it or not, whether the people who are running the conference today realize it or not. Okay? It's a self-selecting culture. You're going to attract people who are like yourself. If you found a culture that's based on a bunch of people screaming at each other, big shock, you're going to attract more people who like to scream at each other. Okay? If you attract one that's based on politeness, humility, and respect, you're going to attract more people like that. Even sometimes, though a founder can be booted. There was a project at Apache. The founder went away for a couple of years, and the culture kept going. The founder came back and was suddenly acting very differently and decided he was going to change the direction of the project. And people were freaked out. They're like, what do we do? This guy started this place, and now he's being a jerk. And they wound up throwing him out, but not without a whole bunch of wringing of hands and people being upset. A lot of people like to vote, okay? We come in a country based on voting. And if you're in a healthy community, you should rarely need to vote, because when you reach a point where you're like, okay, we're going to vote on this. Everybody who's on my side, come over here, and everybody who's on so-and-so side, go over there. Immediately, you've got a set of winners and a set of losers, okay? When you're working with a team of people writing software in a consensus-based manner, you want people to work towards consensus. Voting is a sign of failed consensus. We couldn't get the consensus, we punted, so we're going to vote. It's not a way of just validly saying, okay, I'll throw this out, let's just vote on it. Well, ideas from part 1 and ideas from part 2 might both be good. There might be some stuff we can take from each one of them and come up with a part 3 that has a little bit of both and maybe a little bit less of both. That's even better. And this is, I'm not going to read this quote, but I love this quote, and I like to point it out to people who think they're really smart. And I'm assuming that's you. Years ago, there was the common genius, right? The genius who would walk around and they would be sort of the queen bee of the hive, and they would be treat people poorly. They'd be a bit of a prima donna. They do whatever the heck they want. The fact of the matter is that we've reached a point today. What's that? Bye, everybody. Is it that bad? Wow. The fact of the matter is that there's actually so many geniuses around working in computer sciences today that you can't actually just be a jerk anymore, because there's genius as a commodity. So how do we identify these poisonous people? Okay, what are we looking for when we decide someone's a poisonous person, and when should we flip the bozo bit and decide that they're no longer worth dealing with? Communications annoyances. That might be a way, thank you very much, that might be a way of determining that someone could be a poisonous person. They might have silly nicknames. They might use one nickname in their email. We had a guy once, his email was like sirhaxalot@gmail.com, and then his IRC handle was Woody Haxwell, you know? And I'm like, who is this guy? And like, does he really correlate with that guy? That sort of thing. They might do something like, I don't know, overuse capital letters, okay? They might go be into punctuation or that sort of thing. They might talk like they're from MySpace. Anybody here from MySpace? I don't know. Some people are just clueless. They can't pick up on the mood. You know, the kind of person who walks into a quiet room and everybody's quietly studying, and they slam their bag down like, hey, what's up, guys? You're like, people do this on the internet all the time. They'll show up in a mailing list and be like, what are we going to do tomorrow? Let's rewrite Make. Don't ever do that, please. Actually, my grand boss, wrote Make. And when he first met me, he apologized about the tabs thing. So he's really sorry, just to let you know in case you're wondering. These people, they don't understand the goals of the community. They might ask tons of questions that are already documented or in the FAQ are really obvious, okay? Some people show up who are hostile, okay? They're going to start off by insulting your status quo. They're going to angrily demand help. I have gotten your free piece of software. It does not work for me. I want you to fix it and make it better. Now! And people are sitting there going, what the hell? Some people attempt to blackmail you. You know, if you guys add this feature to your software, I'm prepared to bring 10 developers on to work on it. Really? Well, why don't you bring them on today and work with us? Well, you know, that sort of thing. Some people just want to make people angry. Okay? Some people, there's also the cute accusations of conspiracy, you know. It's the cabal. There's an old boys network here and new people, you know, you're just trying to keep us down and run it. Interesting when someone just shows up and suddenly understands your entire culture, front to back, top to bottom. There's also the person who's a bit arrogant, okay? Their opinion's great. They're not going to acknowledge that other people have opinions. They're going to make sweeping claims about the future success. If you don't include this feature, you're just going to completely be destroyed and taken over by terrible people, and the whole world's going to come to an end. They're going to go and reopen a topic that was long settled years ago or months ago. Again, this is where you point them at the web page. They're not going to read the archives anyway because they're too conceited and they're much better than the rest of you. And then, lastly, this is obvious, just someone's not going to cooperate. They're going to come in and complain, but they don't want to fix anything. They're not going to discuss design. They're too insecure to take criticism. Okay, and that last one's a really tricky one because taking criticism is really hard. But you know, I've given now over 150 different presentations at different conferences outside of Google. And one of the hardest things out there is to find somebody who will give you good criticism. Okay? There's a lot of people who will just give you criticism, but getting good criticism is really tricky. And finding people you know and trust who will give you that criticism, worth their weight in gold. A little side note there. So let's move on to the last part and talk about disinfecting. Unfortunately, there is no Lysol for programmers. If there was, I would buy some. The first thing to do is determine what is the damage? What is this person doing to the project? What are they doing to harm the project? There's two critical questions you're going to ask yourself here. First, are they draining attention and focus? Okay? If so, are they likely to benefit the project anyway? Is there a trade-off here? Okay? The second is, are they paralyzing the project? Okay, is this dispute likely to finish, or is this going to go on forever? Okay, those two things are very important, but you shouldn't do a lot of different things. shouldn't feed the energy creature. Okay, there's an old Usenet adage. Remember when Usenet was alive, like 1,000 years ago? Those were the days. People used to get yelled at for having signatures more than 4 lines. Like, you're wasting bandwidth, you know, and now there's cat videos, you know, thanks to some people in the room. Hey, Greg, how are you? But they're fast cat videos, right? Don't give jerks purchase. Don't want to give them an angle, okay? I live in Chicago. I sometimes drive in Chicago, although I'm not a big fan of driving in traffic. And every once in a while, I'm not a perfect driver. You know that 80% people think that they drive better than the average driver? Think about that for a second. I'm probably not better than the average driver. Once in a while, I will make a mistake and pull in front of someone. And the first thing they do, you can see them scream like, you can totally tell what they're, what I'll usually do is I'll turn, I'll wave at them. I'm like, hi. And then they just explode. They just go completely nuts because this whole like energy they're throwing at you, you don't give them an opportunity for it. If I turn around and yell at them, they'd probably yell at me and windows would be rolled down and things thrown. And, you know, I'm no good at that sort of thing. But don't give people sort of a part to grip and start a fight with you. Engage people, okay? But don't get emotional, okay? Don't engage them, but don't get emotional with them, okay? We had, there was one guy who showed up and told us, you know, that basically our open source project completely sucked and we were doing it wrong. And, you know, if people would have started a big fight with him, there would have been this huge thing went on and people basically just ignored him. Things you can do. If a new person comes to your project and wants to help you out, pay careful attention to them. They might be a jerk. They might be the next release manager for your project. They might be your next really big contributor. But if someone shows up with emotion, look for the fact under the emotion, okay? We had one guy, a raving lunatic, okay? Actually, a guy who's very famous in the open source world, and I will not mention his name. But he showed up one day, and he was hopping mad because of a bug in Subversion, and this was a very long time ago. And it wasn't actually in Subversion, it was in a piece of software we used. And he showed up, and he goes, you guys are a bunch of rank amateurs. I can't believe you ship software with this kind of a bug in it, blah, blah, blah. And one of our engineers responded and said, you know, can you tell me about the version you're using of this and so? Because I think there might be something here and blah, blah, blah. And he wrote back, yeah, I'm using version this or that. And, you know, blah, blah, blah. How stupid of you to blah, blah, blah. And the guy's like, you know, I think I've actually found a real bug here. I filed it under this issue number, and you can take a look at it if you'd like. And, you know, we're going to get it fixed and rolled out in the next version, so thanks a lot. And the guy was like, thanks for anything. You know, you shouldn't have written this in the first place. Blah, blah. And everybody watching this was like, wow, what a jerk. I mean, at the day, I lost a lot of respect that I had for this guy. Repel trolls with niceness, okay? That's another thing. Anybody here ever used IRC? You know, there's a lot of trolls in IRC. We had a guy show up, because Subversion guys used to hang out, well, they still do hang out in a public IRC channel. And this guy comes up, and he was furious, hopping mad that he couldn't get something to run on BSD. And everybody's like, well, what version of this do you have? You know, what version of that do you have? And people were just sort of asking questions. And then eventually he said, and I quote, he said, well, I came here to get into an argument. You know, he's like, this isn't a lot of fun at all. And he just disappeared. Strangest thing. And lastly, and this is probably the most important thing of all, as fun as it is to talk about, you know, booting people out of your community or yelling at or you know, getting rid of them, you really want to focus on the behavior and not the individual. Okay, we did have one guy who was really smart, who did a lot of work for Subversion, but he was really abrasive, and he said things that came across as really, really harsh. And one of our engineers pulled him aside and talked to him a little bit about that, and he just had no idea. He didn't even realize. He's like, that's just kind of the way I am. He's like, I'll try and do a little better, but, you know, it just comes across that way. And so we understood that. He did get a little bit better, but we reached a point where, after that, where we just realized this is how he is, and we weren't going to freak out about it. And he was a really good contributor and a big help. So we were okay with that. So, again, we've covered a lot of different things here, but I want to, there's 4 really big things to remember, okay? Comprehend what the problem is and preserve your attention and focus. You have to fortify, and a healthy community is the best way to fortify against poisonous people. Identify what the problem is, and lastly, disinfect, and there's ways to get rid of it. Now, there's a little bit of a secret here, okay? And I talked a little bit about this. But this doesn't just apply to open source communities. It could be any group where there's more than 2 people. It could be running a conference. It could be a church club. It could be a group of people hanging out talking about bowling. It could be absolutely anything. But that is pretty much it about poisonous people. So thank you. I think we have time to take a few more questions. If there's anything I could elaborate on or anybody wants to debate me on something, I'm more than glad to talk about it. Yes, in the middle. What's the best way to approach a personal friend and tell them they're a bad programmer? Delicately and with care. It's really the best way to. There is no best way, I guess, that I can think of. It depends on the person how willing they are to accept any kind of criticism. A lot of it, sometimes people just can't understand. I've actually worked with people in the past who just couldn't understand that they weren't a good programmer. You might be working with them and have the opportunity to do some code reviews and review some of their code and point out examples of code that's really good, point out why this is inefficient, et cetera. It's very tricky, though. So I would say carefully. And again, the thing about criticism, I'll point out, I'm sorry, I guess I got some questions, but I'll point out one important thing about criticism is that if anybody's ever read a book on management or criticism, they always say to use what they call the compliment sandwich, okay? Where you walk over and you're like, Dan, you really write good code, okay? But all the stuff you wrote over here is terrible, inefficient, won't scale, and some of the worst stuff I've ever seen. But you got a nice beard there. Okay, that's the compliment sandwich. What Dan's going to walk out of the room saying, hey, he likes my beard. Okay, he's not going to hear that middle part. So, again, but be careful and sensitive. Who's in the middle here? Yes? Focus on the behavior, not the individual. Okay, so when you, for example, if you want to push something out of the community, you don't necessarily want to push a person out of the community. You want to push that behavior, okay? So I've seen a lot of times where people are afraid to say something directly to someone in a very straightforward manner. So if Dan, again, to use an example, shows up on our mailing list and he is being very rude, I would say, look, we don't talk to people in this manner here, okay? The point that you're trying to make around the code is good, blah, 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 but let's focus on the code, not making ad hominem attacks. Yes?
Have you ever had a situation, you said that you can make trade-offs when people are really good coders, but they're a little bit abrasive, and you have a trade-off there where you keep them around because they're so useful. Have you ever made a trade-off the other way around where they're really useful socially, they're great people, but they don't write the best code?
That's an excellent question. I talked about making trade-offs when someone maybe writes really good code, but a little bit abrasive. And I do stress a little bit, right? I said that genius is a commodity. You shouldn't let someone come in and ruin your community. Other question is, do you let some people hang around if they're really good at the social and the community part, but not so much at the coding? And the answer is absolutely. And I would say open source tends to be really bad at that. Open source tends to give all the credit to people who write code. People who write documentation, who build the community, who answer user questions, do all this stuff, are typically looked upon as second citizens. Anybody can do that kind of crap. Well, first of all, it's not true that anybody can do that kind of crap. Typically, engineers are terrible at that kind of crap. But it's really, really important. So I would say building a community where you can value people like that is going to be a huge help and help you to get. And one of the reasons Subversion became really successful. It was out originally to take over the open source world. Instead, we've taken over the corporate world, which is really bizarre. But one of the things that got us going early was that we had great documentation. I wrote the book, so I think it's great. But beyond that, we still had great documentation that was freely available. But we also had a lot of people helping our users. And those are the kind of things that help get people, to use more of your software.
Yeah, just to add on that, sometimes it actually works well for some of those non-technical people to help deal with those abrasive people sort of off-thread. You can email them off-thread or maybe even have a phone conversation. Crazy idea.
Any other questions? Anyway, way in the back. Oh. So one at a time then, please, because I have a small brain. How do you do people who are completely unmotivated? Completely unmotivated? I'm not very good at that. If people are completely unmotivated, I don't know why would you really care? That's really hard. You know, I mean, there's a reason I work at Google. It's because I tend to work at, and not saying that Google's the only company that has a lot of smart people. There's a lot of companies that were here yesterday at the career fair who've got a lot of smart people that work there. But I want to work with really smart people who are really motivated and who like to do things. You do run into situations. Sometimes it's in a class project where you're working with a group or where somebody just doesn't give a care. And, you know, the best thing I could say for that is to try and encourage them a little bit, but if not, do your best to keep them out of the way and get the stuff done. Focus on what you're there to do. You know, my mom told me something a lot growing up, and that's life's not fair. You know, and she could never possibly have been more right about that. And to answer your question, to sort of elaborate on that a little bit about unmotivated people, anybody here seen the movie Incredibles? I'm a huge, unabashed, unapologetic Pixar fan. There's a lot of extras on it, and at the end of it, they've got this fake interviews with, like, you know, entertainment reporters and the characters. And the one guy asks Edna Mode, darling, it was wonderful, asks Edna, you know, is it really hard to work with superheroes? You know, I've heard they're really, you know, hard to work with. She says, no, darling, superheroes are easy. It is the mediocre people that are hard to work with, and they're in such great supply. And I was like, wow, that's not like software engineering or what? So, what was the second part of your question? Wow. I love those kind of people. The question is, what about people who try and grab all the work? Typically, if someone's doing a lot of stuff or very active, that's often good, but you have to sort of sometimes talk to them a little bit if they're picking up everything, right? And if they're well, you see, you didn't tell me that part. That's different. I've actually seen that where someone floods a project with mediocre code, and the good guys have to spend a ridiculous amount of time reviewing that code, okay? And in fact, if you look at the net output, it's less than it would be with everyone else minus this guy. So that's really hard. The way to do that is to be uncompromising on your reviews of the code so that they understand that it takes some time. And what you're going to wind up doing, you're not going to want to review the mediocre code, so you're going to put it off a little bit, and you're going to take longer to review the code. And that's going to eventually slow them down one way or another. But, you know, you can't compromise that. That's where code reviews come in really handy. If you don't have code reviews, someone can just start plowing crappy code into your repository, and there's nothing you can do about it except watch it go in and watch your software just go to hell.
You want to talk about review then commit?
Review then commit. Okay, yeah, that's great. There's two generally accepted ways of doing code review. One is the review then commit, where your code has to be reviewed before it goes in the repository or the canonical repository. The other one is to commit it and then have it reviewed. And they're both very effective. They both really work well. There's advantages to each one. I've got to say that for years in the open source world, I did commit then review, and I thought it was the best way ever. And then when I started at Google, we do review then commit, and I was like, it felt like it was slowing me down a little bit. But in hindsight, I actually prefer it now. I prefer it a great deal. Although, you know, don't listen to me. I'm an engineering manager now. I used to write C++, now I write email. So I don't know if I have any right to say that. The great thing about email is it's like launch early, launch often, right? I think we have time for one more comment or question. Yes, right here. So the question is, if you have one of the original founders of a community, one of your friends who tries to fragment the community as a power play, try and get people to sort of come with them, I assume, or do what I want to do and not do what they want to do. Is that sort of that thing? Sort of like that? Not sure what he's up to. Okay. I recommend backing up and nuking from orbit. No, I'm kidding. That's a really tricky thing to do, and sometimes. So, how many people in here hate politics? How many hate politics? Okay, guess what? You're soaking in it. Okay, Politics is anywhere you get more than 2 people together. Okay? It's a simple fact. There's a lot of different things you can do it. Some people may feel a little weird about it, but a lot of it comes to how strong is the group of people you have. If you have a cohesive group of people and someone goes completely apeshit, they're not likely to cause a ton of damage because the other people have some strong social bonds. If you don't have a strong community, that's when you're vulnerable to disruption by even a founder or that sort of thing. What I would recommend in that case is to publicly, on a mailing list that say you have or whatever, not, continue to talk about what's important to the community and start talking with people who you know and trust and work with in the community and have them continue to do that. And sometimes you might have back channel discussions with people about, look, let's focus on doing this to lessen this person's impact because they're affecting what our goal is. But again, if you don't have a common stated goal, if you don't have a mission, if you don't have this sort of thing, that's when it becomes really hard to do that, because if it's not all written down, then who's to say they're doing the wrong thing, right? So it's really tricky, and it's probably, the social stuff is really, really hard, and I think it's way harder than technical problems. When people ask Eric Schmidt what the biggest difficulty confronting Google going ahead is, he responds almost every single time, it's the rapid rate at which we're growing. And so rapidly growing and keeping your culture infused in all the people that you're hiring. It's like a tree, right? The trunk of the tree is the founders. It's the people who have been here a while. They understand the culture. They get it. They've been drinking the Kool-Aid. And then you get the branches and these leaf nodes. Exactly. These leaf nodes that just sort of don't quite understand in some cases how it's all working, especially if you're growing big and fast. So, okay. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. We'll be here for a few more minutes afterwards.